Swat Valley. And we may be seeing it also with Iran. The elections in June demonstrated to Iran's people, most of all, the moral bankruptcy of their leaders. Even the Shiite religious establishment has largely turned against Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's regimes, and his tactics have united Iran's fractured opposition groups into a broad social movement, not unlike the Solidarity movement that over a decade succeeded in toppling communist rule in Poland in the 1980s. The Iranian economy is getting no better. Inflation runs about 25%, youth unemployment is sky high, and negative social indicators like drug addiction and prostitution are on the rise. This is a regime waiting to be kicked over the edge. And finally, tallying Israel's strength, let's go back to the subject of Zionism. In 2006, Israel mobilized its reserves for the war in Lebanon. I was there at the time. Astonishingly, the call-up rate was more than 100%. That is, people too old to serve or people living abroad made it a point of coming back to the country in order to fight for it. It's hard to imagine anywhere else in the world where something similar could happen. Now, having tallied, as I see them, the assets as well as the liabilities, how are we to make sense of this? The question remains, will Israel survive? Let me offer you a very Israeli answer to that question. The answer would be, it's dependent. I see three things that Israelis and Jews need to do. Number one, get the sequencing right. The paradox of Israeli life is that it exists in two very different kinds of time. One is nanosecond time, the nanosecond reactions to terrorist attacks, the nanosecond speeds of Israeli-designed microprocessors, the nanosecond decision of putting a bomb on a target. The second kind of time is historical time, which in the Middle East is generational time, millennial time, you might even say even geological time. And there is a temptation to want to apply the first measure of time to the second. That is, to resolve all problems now, immediately, when those problems may be operating according to a very different timetable, a very different logic, a very different schedule. Now, in order to address the long-term challenges to Israel's existence, it seems to me that Israel first has to survive its most immediate threats. Typically, left-wing Israelis often make the point that unless Israel addresses the demographic time bomb by implementing a two-state solution, it will eventually self-destruct as a Jewish and democratic state. This point is inarguable. Israel needs a two-state solution, something even Benjamin Netanyahu has come to recognize. But it is equally inarguable that this time bomb isn't going to detonate for another 20 or 30 years. And there is a big difference between a two-state solution in theory and a two-state solution in practice. Right now, in practice, the only way Israel is going to get two states on terms that are acceptable to a majority of Israelis is through a second disengagement, in which Israel withdraws to borders it decides on, and on terms the current crop of Palestinian leaders are sure to reject. This means no peace treaty, and it creates conditions that would be ripe for Hamas to exploit, just as they did in Gaza. And it's entirely clear to me that it is in Israel's interests, it's not entirely clear to me, in fact, it's not at all clear to me, that it is in any way in Israel's interest to allow that to happen, especially not when Hamas grows ever more closely allied with the regime in Tehran. So Israel is vastly better served by delaying the two-state solution and going for interim steps instead until such a time when conditions in the neighborhood improve. And no single force contributes more to the deterioration of political conditions in the region than Iran. It does so through its support for Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, and militant groups in Iraq, both Sunni and Shiite. It does so by its interference in the politics of Egypt and Lebanon and the Persian Gulf. And its ability to make mischief will only be turbocharged by possession of a nuclear arsenal. So, stopping Iran in its nuclear bid is the sine qua non of Israel's survival. Not just because the immediate threat, not just because of the immediate threat it would pose, because the immediate threat it would pose to Israel is so grave, but because it would prevent Israel from being able to address all of its long-term challenges 5, 10, 15, and 20 years down the road. Secondly, make a better case for Israel, or make the case for Israel better. Eric Hoffer, the great longshoreman and 20th century philosopher, said many years ago that Israel is the only country in the world expected to behave like a nation of Christian gentlemen. To an extent that is depressing to acknowledge, Israel will always be hated for what it is, no matter what it does. This is the reality of Jewish history, the burden of Jewish fate. In every generation, they rise up against us to destroy us. But none of this means that Israel is fated to lose the battle of hearts and minds among fair-minded people who, from one generation to the next, must learn anew what the case for Israel is. Today, the case that most urgently needs to be made for Israel is the liberal case. As a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, it is very easy for me and natural to me to make a right-of-center case for Israel. Throughout America, Christian Zionists are making a powerful Christian case for Israel. For all of our mishugas, Jews, broadly speaking, can make, of course, the Jewish case for Israel. But what is the liberal case for Israel? I often go to college campuses where I address audiences very unlike this one, audiences of very young people, not all of them, or not even a majority of them Jewish, many of them non-committal about Israel, and many of them also hostile, at least in a kind of vague sense, but hostile to Israel. And I always put the following case to them. I ask them, these young kids, I say, how many of you are for gay rights? All hands go up. I say, great. How many of you think that gays should serve in the military? Should be allowed to serve in the military openly? All hands go up. Terrific. Then I ask, how many of you feel that women are as entitled to every single choice and opportunity as a man is in society? How many of you believe in women's rights in the broadest sense? All hands go up. Metsuyan, Yofi, it's wonderful. Then I say, how many of you think that if you're an artist, one of your rights is the right to offend the sensibilities of your audience? All hands go up. How many of you think that if you're a politician and you've committed a crime, say you've embezzled money, or say you've sexually harassed one of your employees, how many of you think that you should be prosecuted by the law, if necessary, through criminal charges? All hands go up. How many of you think that if you're accused of a crime, you have a right to a decent, impartial jury and judge and trial and appeal if necessary? All hands go up. How many of you are opposed to the death penalty? Most hands go up. Now, having laid all of that out, I turn to these kids and I say, terrific. The only country in the Middle East that has applied precisely the values I have described consistently and ever more broadly is Israel. It is not Palestine, where gay Palestinians flee for their lives and wind up on the streets of South Tel Aviv. It is not Jordan or Egypt, where honor killings of women are endemic. It is not Iran, which has, after China, the highest execution rate in the world. It is not Egypt, which has lived under the emergency orders of a military regime for the past 28 years. The only country that espouses the values that you have just professed to me through your votes are your own is Israel. So, before you criticize Israel, Before you call it an apartheid state, ignoring the 120,000 Ethiopian Africans who are Jews, or the 75,000 Indians, or the 2 million Sephardic Jews, before you do that, tell me, by all means criticize Israel, but don't do so from the standpoint of a hypocrite to your own values. That, to me, seems to me the case that urgently needs to be made for Israel now, urgently needs to be made among your children or your grandchildren on college campuses, and if we can make that case effectively, we will have won over a new generation to this cause, to this country. Now, finally, I want to conclude by talking about what I think is the most essential ingredient to Israel's survival, and that is Jewish loyalty. It is the answer to the sociological problems that confront Israel today, the splits between the Haredi communities or the ultra-Orthodox communities and the more secular communities, between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazis, between Israel and the diaspora. Now, what do I mean by loyalty? I do not mean, as so many anti-Semites and Israel bashers suggest, a loyalty that supersedes the obligations we owe America legally and morally and emotionally. On the contrary, it is precisely because the state of Israel and the law of return gives each of us, at least those of us in this room who are Jews, the right to be citizens of Israel, that we have to honor the choice we have made by remaining citizens of the United States. At the same time, I do not mean by loyalty a kind of loyalty limited only to, quote, our kind of Jew, religious or secular, right-wing or left-wing. It is this kind of narrow Jewish loyalty that has led to some of the worst betrayals in Jewish history, from the disloyalty of Bar Kamsa that led to the destruction of the Second Temple, to the disloyalty of a right-wing fanatic named Yigal Amir that led to the murder of Yitzhak Rabin, to the left-wing disloyalty of people like Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein, who traffic on their Jewishness in order to promote arguments and agendas that give aid and comfort to Israel's worst enemies. Rather, what I mean by loyalty is the loyalty of a warm breast, a sense of decent respect and affection, that I feel toward every Jew, whether he shares my notions of observance or not, whether he shares my politics or not. It is the kind of loyalty that allows me to argue till I'm blue in the face, but not get up and leave the table. It is the loyalty that requires me to listen to what others have to say. It is the loyalty the loyalty that propels me to extend a hand when I'm tempted to recoil in anger. It is the loyalty that makes me contribute to Jewish causes, providing aid and comfort to Jews in need. It is the loyalty I owe to my grandmother and my mother as they held fast to a faith through the darkness of the Holocaust in Europe, and to my cousins in Israel who send their children to war while I opine upon the tactics of the Israeli military from the safety of my office at the Wall Street Journal. It is the loyalty that reminds us that the core of Jewish faith is that I am my brother's keeper, even if I might sometimes be his critic. The loyalty that led Esau to embrace his brother Jacob, and Joseph to forgive his brothers. It is the loyalty we owe Israel. It is the loyalty Israels owe each other, and above all, it is the loyalty we owe ourselves. You have done me a great honor by asking me to be your speaker for the 25th Memorial Harold Hoffman Lecture. Thank you for listening to me so attentively. Thank you, Rabbi. Yes. It is the case that Israel is more united politically today because Israelis from pretty much not the very far left, but certainly from the mainstream left to the right, understand that Palestinian politics today is nowhere close to where it needs to be in order to achieve a lasting peace. And my advice to Israelis on the subject of a Palestinian state is the same advice that sailors used to tattoo on their hands when they go up on the yardarms on square-rigged ships. They would tattoo HOL